Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The experiment begins. The air thrummed with restless energy as Jackson Reed, a man who had built an empire from the ground up, stepped into the bustling international terminal. Jackson wasn't just any man, he was a visionary, a philanthropist, and a quiet force who had reshaped industries and empowered communities. But today, he wasn't a celebrated entrepreneur or a revered guest speaker. Today, he was conducting an experiment, one that would strip away his accolades, wealth, and status, leaving him vulnerable to the judgment of others. Jackson's attire was intentional, a faded denim jacket over a gray cashmere sweater, simple slacks, and sturdy walking shoes. His briefcase, though leather, showed years of use, with its tarnished brass clasps. To the world, he was just another middle-aged man trying to catch a flight. His experiment was simple yet profound. He wanted to observe how society treated him based solely on appearances. He'd lived a life of privilege and recognition for years, but he hadn't forgotten the prejudices he faced as a young black man growing up in a world where appearances often dictated opportunities. As he navigated through the terminal, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint tang of jet fuel. The departure board flickered above him, its destinations, London, Tokyo, Dubai, calling out like gateways to endless possibilities. Yet, Jackson's focus wasn't on the places these planes would take him, but on the interactions that would unfold before him. The line at the check-in counter was long, snaking around barriers with travelers from all walks of life. There were families laden with strollers and toys, young couples clutching passports, and businessmen typing furiously on their smartphones. Jackson fell into line, his demeanor calm and composed. He noticed the subtle glances cast his way, the kind that lingered just long enough to be uncomfortable. A woman ahead of him clutched her purse a little tighter, her fingers gripping the strap with unnecessary force. A man behind him muttered something under his breath, his tone dismissive. Jackson had expected this. It wasn't the first time he had been underestimated or judged, but today, he felt the sting more acutely. He had chosen this path voluntarily, knowing full well the emotional toll it would take. His goal was not to wallow in victimhood but to confront the biases head-on and understand the depth of human superficiality. When he reached the counter, the agent barely glanced at him before her eyes returned to her computer screen. "Passport?" she asked curtly, her tone devoid of warmth. Jackson handed over his documents without comment. The agent's eyebrows furrowed slightly as she scanned his ticket. "This is a business-class ticket," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes, it is," Jackson replied evenly, his calm tone masking the slight irritation bubbling within him. The agent hesitated for a moment before continuing the check-in process. Jackson could sense her skepticism, though she didn't voice it outright. When she finally handed him his boarding pass, her demeanor was still cold and detached. "Next," she called out, dismissing him without a second glance. Jackson moved on to security, where the experience was no different. He was pulled aside for additional screening, the security officer patting him down with an air of suspicion. He knew the routine all too well and complied without complaint. Inside, though, he couldn't help but wonder how many others faced this treatment daily, their dignity chipped away piece by piece. Once through security, Jackson made his way to the boarding gate. The waiting area was already filling up, passengers clustering around with their carry-ons and headphones. Jackson found a seat near the window, where sunlight streamed in, illuminating the tarmac beyond. As he sat, he noticed the whispers. Two younger men seated nearby exchanged glances, their hushed voices carrying just enough for Jackson to catch snippets of their conversation. "Do you think he's in the right line?" one of them murmured. "No way," the other replied, chuckling. "Probably trying to sneak into business class." Jackson didn't react outwardly, but their words echoed in his mind. The assumptions people made were often so swift, so unthinking, that they revealed the deep-seated prejudices lurking beneath the surface. When the boarding announcement came, Jackson rose with the first group, business-class passengers. The murmurs grew louder, the disbelief palpable. As he approached the gate agent, she glanced at his boarding pass, then at him, her hesitation evident. After a moment, she waved him through, but the momentary pause spoke volumes. On the plane, Jackson settled into his seat, a comfortable spot in business class, with ample legroom and a wide array of amenities. The flight attendant greeted him with a polite smile, but Jackson noticed the flicker of surprise in her eyes. He gave her a warm smile in return, determined not to let the subtle biases taint his resolve. As other passengers boarded, Jackson's seatmate arrived, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit who exuded an air of self-importance. The man glanced at Jackson, his expression shifting from indifference to mild annoyance. Without a word, he placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment and sank into his seat, his body angled slightly away from Jackson as though to create an invisible barrier. The flight attendant came by to offer pre-flight drinks, and Jackson ordered a glass of water. His seatmate, meanwhile, requested champagne, his tone sharp and condescending. "And make it quick," he added, as though the flight attendant were his personal servant. As the plane taxied to the runway, Jackson closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He had already gathered enough material for his experiment, but he knew the journey was far from over. The real test would come when the time came for him to reveal who he truly was. For now, he let the hum of the engine soothe his thoughts, preparing himself for the challenges ahead. He wasn't just conducting this experiment for himself, he was doing it for everyone who had ever been judged, dismissed, or overlooked. And when the moment came to speak his truth, he would do so with the quiet strength and dignity that had carried him through a lifetime of challenges. The plane ascended steadily, the hum of the engines blending with the occasional murmur of passengers settling into their seats. Jackson sat quietly, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. He had spent years flying around the world, often in seats like this, but today the experience felt different. His experiment was already revealing truths that weighed heavy on his heart. The man seated next to him, whose tailored suit and gold cufflinks spoke of success, seemed determined to ignore him. He sat rigidly, his body language closed off, flipping through a business magazine with exaggerated focus. Every now and then, the man would glance sideways, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mild disdain, as though he were trying to piece together how someone like Jackson had ended up in this section of the plane. Jackson felt the weight of the man's unspoken judgment but didn't let it disturb his calm. He had faced worse, blatant discrimination, outright hostility, and had risen above it every time. This, he reminded himself, was just another test of patience and resilience. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile, offering Jackson a menu for the in-flight meal. He thanked her and opened it, scanning the options. His seatmate, however, seemed less courteous. When she turned to him, he waved her off with a dismissive gesture. "Just bring me the steak," he said curtly, barely looking up. Jackson caught the flight attendant's fleeting expression of discomfort before she masked it with professionalism. He felt a pang of empathy for her. The man's attitude wasn't new to Jackson, he had encountered similar behavior countless times in boardrooms, conferences, and social events. It was the arrogance of those who assumed their position in life entitled them to treat others with disdain. As the flight progressed, Jackson's focus shifted to the other passengers. He observed how they interacted, how they treated the crew, and how their behavior revealed subtle hierarchies of power and privilege. A young couple a few rows ahead was engrossed in conversation, their laughter infectious and genuine. Behind them, an older woman adjusted her blanket, her demeanor quiet and contemplative. Further back, a teenager fiddled with his headphones, scrolling through a playlist on his phone. But not everyone was as absorbed in their own world. Jackson noticed a man across the aisle, stealing glances in his direction. The man, who appeared to be in his 30s, wore a casual polo shirt and jeans. He seemed intrigued by Jackson, though not in the same judgmental way as Jackson's seatmate. Instead, there was curiosity in his gaze, as though he were trying to place Jackson in a context that made sense to him. Eventually, the man leaned over slightly, offering a friendly smile. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but hesitant. "I couldn't help but notice your briefcase. It looks well-traveled." Jackson glanced at the briefcase resting at his feet. Its leather was scuffed and worn, the brass clasps dulled with age. It had been his companion through countless journeys, a symbol of the life he had built through hard work and determination. "It's seen its share of miles," Jackson replied with a smile. "A reliable companion." The man nodded, his curiosity growing. "If you don't mind me asking, what do you do? You seem seasoned." Jackson chuckled softly at the choice of words. "I've had my hand in a few things over the years," he said, keeping his response deliberately vague. He wasn't ready to reveal too much just yet. His experiment depended on maintaining the illusion of anonymity. The man seemed to sense that Jackson wasn't inclined to elaborate and didn't press further. Instead, he shifted the conversation to more general topics: travel, favorite destinations, and the unpredictable nature of international airports. Jackson found himself enjoying the exchange, the man's genuine interest a refreshing contrast to the cold indifference of his seatmate. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the in-flight meal. The flight attendant placed a tray in front of Jackson, her demeanor professional but warmer this time, as though she had sensed his kindness earlier. His seatmate received his steak with the same curt acknowledgement he had given before, cutting into it without so much as a thank you. As Jackson ate, he reflected on the dynamics around him. The interactions he observed painted a vivid picture of human nature: kindness, indifference, prejudice, and curiosity all coexisting in a confined space thousands of feet above the ground. It was a microcosm of the world, a reminder of the complexities that defined human relationships. After the meal, the cabin lights dimmed, signaling the beginning of the night portion of the flight. Some passengers pulled out blankets and neck pillows, preparing to sleep. Others tapped away on laptops or scrolled through in-flight entertainment. Jackson's seatmate put on noise-canceling headphones and reclined his seat, signaling his intention to avoid any further interaction. Jackson, however, remained alert. He wasn't tired, his mind too occupied with thoughts of the experiment. He retrieved a small notebook from his briefcase and began jotting down observations. The act of writing was therapeutic, helping him process the emotions stirred by the day's events. He didn't notice the flight attendant approaching until she spoke softly. "Can I get you anything else, sir? Another glass of water, perhaps?" Jackson looked up, surprised by her attentiveness. "Thank you, water would be great," he said, closing his notebook. She returned moments later with a glass of water, her smile genuine. "I hope you're enjoying the flight," she said. "I am, thank you," Jackson replied, his tone warm. "And I appreciate the effort you and your colleagues put into making us comfortable." Her smile widened, a hint of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." As she walked away, Jackson felt a surge of hope. Small gestures of kindness, like the one he had just offered, had the power to bridge divides and remind people of their shared humanity. It was a lesson he had learned early in life and one he carried with him always. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully. When the plane began its descent, Jackson closed his notebook and prepared for landing. The anticipation of what lay ahead filled him with a mix of excitement and trepidation. His experiment wasn't over yet, the most revealing moments were still to come. After the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the passengers began gathering their belongings. Jackson retrieved his briefcase and stood, allowing his seatmate to exit first. The man barely acknowledged him, brushing past with the same air of superiority he had carried throughout the flight. As Jackson stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he felt the weight of the experiment lifting slightly. The judgments and assumptions he had encountered during the journey had been painful but enlightening. He had seen the best and worst of human nature, the small kindnesses and the quiet prejudices that shaped everyday interactions. Now, as he walked through the terminal, blending into the crowd once again, he prepared for the next phase of his journey. There were still truths to uncover, conversations to have, and, perhaps, a moment to reveal who he truly was. Jackson was ready, his heart steady and his mind clear, knowing that his experiment had the potential to inspire change in ways he had yet to imagine. The terminal was alive with a familiar buzz as travelers disembarked and filtered into the sprawling space, each person a unique story in motion. Jackson moved with the steady pace of someone accustomed to the rhythm of airports, but not hurried by it. His worn briefcase swung lightly at his side, its familiar weight grounding him amid the swirl of motion. As he stepped past a duty-free store and into the flow of passengers, the experiment resumed. He found himself studying the faces around him, trying to read their thoughts and emotions. Some faces were neutral, others excited, and a few betrayed exhaustion. But there were also those moments, the subtle flick of an eye, the tightening of a jaw, that revealed judgment. These were the moments Jackson was attuned to, the unspoken reactions people had to someone they thought they understood with a glance. As he approached the airline's lounge, a calm sanctuary amid the chaos, Jackson prepared for another layer of his test. The lounge was exclusive to premium passengers, a quiet space where drinks flowed freely, and comfortable chairs awaited weary travelers. The attendants at the entrance desk were immaculately dressed, their smiles polished but professional. A young man in a sharp navy blazer greeted him, his expression faltering only slightly as Jackson handed over his boarding pass. "Welcome, sir," the attendant said after scanning the pass, his tone respectful, but tinged with hesitation. It was a subtle hesitation, one Jackson would have missed if he weren't so finely attuned to these interactions. Jackson nodded politely and entered the lounge. The space was everything he expected: sleek furniture, ambient lighting, and a carefully curated air of exclusivity. He chose a seat near the large windows overlooking the tarmac, where planes moved with the precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. He placed his briefcase beside him and leaned back, observing the room. It didn't take long for the quiet undercurrents of judgment to surface. Across from him, a middle-aged woman in an elegant pantsuit glanced his way, her gaze lingering a second too long. Her expression was unreadable, but Jackson could sense the calculations happening behind her eyes. A few seats down, a man with graying hair and a Rolex on his wrist glanced up from his tablet, his eyes narrowing briefly before returning to his screen. Jackson let the moments wash over him, unbothered but acutely aware. He pulled a book from his briefcase, an old favorite, its spine cracked and its pages yellowed from years of travel. He opened it and began to read, his focus half on the words and half on the dynamics unfolding around him. A server approached with a tray of drinks. "Can I get you something, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious. "Just water, please," Jackson said with a smile. He could see the surprise flicker across her face. He wasn't ordering champagne or an expensive cocktail, as many in the lounge typically did. The server nodded and walked away, her demeanor professional but slightly puzzled. Moments later, Jackson's seatmate from the plane entered the lounge. The man scanned the room briefly before spotting Jackson. His expression froze for a split second, then shifted to something Jackson recognized all too well: disdain mixed with disbelief. It was as if the man couldn't fathom that Jackson belonged in this space. The man chose a seat on the opposite side of the lounge, his movements deliberate. Jackson chuckled inwardly, the reaction predictable yet still disappointing. He returned to his book, determined not to let the man's attitude affect his mood. Minutes later, the server returned with Jackson's water. She placed it on the table beside him with a smile that seemed more genuine this time. "If you need anything else, just let me know," she said. "Thank you," Jackson replied warmly. He could see the subtle shift in her demeanor, perhaps his kindness had made an impression. It was a small victory, but one that mattered. As the lounge filled with more passengers, Jackson noticed a young woman struggling to find a seat. She carried a large tote bag and a laptop case, her expression frazzled. Without hesitation, Jackson gestured to the empty seat beside him. "You're welcome to sit here," he said, his tone inviting. The woman looked relieved. "Thank you," she said, placing her bags down carefully. She sank into the chair with a sigh, her shoulders relaxing. "Long day?" Jackson asked, his voice light with curiosity. She nodded, offering a tired smile. "Very. I just wrapped up a conference and barely made it to my flight. This lounge is a lifesaver." Jackson nodded. It's good to have a place to unwind before the next leg of the journey. Their conversation flowed naturally, covering topics ranging from travel mishaps to the challenges of balancing work and life. The young woman, whose name was Ava, turned out to be a marketing executive navigating the complexities of her career. She spoke candidly about her experiences, her tone occasionally tinged with frustration, but also determination. As they talked, Jackson noticed how the dynamics in the lounge shifted subtly. People nearby were paying attention, though they tried to appear disinterested. Some glanced over, their curiosity piqued by Jackson's calm demeanor and Ava's animated gestures. Even his former seatmate seemed unable to resist glancing their way occasionally. Ava, unaware of the silent judgments around them, seemed genuinely engaged in the conversation. She asked Jackson about his travels, his favorite destinations, and his thoughts on the future of global business. Jackson answered thoughtfully, sharing insights without revealing too much about his true identity. He was careful to frame his experiences as those of an observer rather than a participant, letting Ava draw her own conclusions. As the time for boarding approached, Ava gathered her belongings and thanked Jackson for the conversation. "It's rare to meet someone so grounded," she said with a smile. "Safe travels." "You too," Jackson replied, his tone warm. "Take care." As Ava walked away, Jackson noticed the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The judgments and assumptions that had hung in the air, like an invisible fog, seemed to dissipate slightly. It was a reminder of the power of connection, how a genuine conversation could challenge preconceptions and foster understanding. When Jackson finally boarded his connecting flight, he felt a sense of accomplishment. The experiment was far from over, but the moments he had experienced so far had reinforced his belief in the importance of challenging biases and assumptions. Each interaction, no matter how small, was a step toward a world where people were judged not by appearances, but by their character. As he settled into his seat, Jackson looked out the window at the fading light of the day. The sky was a canvas of oranges and purples, a reminder of the beauty that existed beyond the confines of human judgment. With a deep breath, he prepared himself for the next leg of his journey, ready to face whatever lessons awaited him. As the plane taxied onto the runway for the second leg of his journey, Jackson leaned back in his seat, letting the low hum of the engines fill the silence around him. This time, he was seated in the first-class cabin, a space even more exclusive than the business class he had occupied earlier. The seats were wider, the amenities more luxurious, and the separation between passengers was a clear marker of privilege. Jackson's presence in this rarefied space seemed to cause subtle ripples of curiosity and unease. From the moment he boarded, he had felt the weight of eyes on him, passengers stealing glances, their expressions ranging from confusion to quiet skepticism. He noticed the flight attendant hesitate slightly as she greeted him, her polite smile faltering for just a moment before she regained her composure. The man seated diagonally across from him, a sharply dressed executive type with perfectly coiffed silver hair, gave Jackson a quick once-over before returning to his tablet. Jackson could feel the questions forming in the man's mind. Who is this? Why is he here? It was a question Jackson had encountered in countless forms throughout his life, though rarely as overtly as it had been during his younger years. Back then, the judgments had been more blatant, the barriers more obvious. But now, in spaces like these, the prejudice wore a thinner veil, cloaked in polite civility and subtle microaggressions. It was there in the guarded smiles, the fleeting looks, the barely audible murmurs exchanged between passengers. The flight attendant returned, offering a glass of champagne. Jackson declined with a gentle shake of his head, requesting water instead. Her reaction was almost imperceptible, a slight widening of her eyes, a nod that was just a fraction slower than normal. He understood her reaction. The people who occupied these seats usually followed a certain script, one of indulgence and entitlement. His quiet demeanor and modest requests disrupted that narrative. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, Jackson opened his notebook once again, jotting down observations. The act of writing had always been a refuge for him, a way to process the world and make sense of its contradictions. He wrote about the unspoken hierarchies he had observed, the ways people assigned value to one another based on superficial markers. The worn leather of his briefcase, the simplicity of his clothing, these were symbols that seemed to invite judgment, even in a space where everyone was theoretically equal in privilege. The sound of a voice pulled him from his thoughts. It was the man seated across from him, who had put down his tablet and now addressed Jackson with a polite but pointed tone. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying the clipped cadence of someone accustomed to being heard. "I couldn't help but notice your briefcase. It has character." Jackson glanced at the briefcase resting beside his seat. Its scuffed leather and tarnished brass clasps a stark contrast to the sleek designer luggage that surrounded them. "It does," Jackson replied, his tone calm and measured. "It's been with me for a long time." The man nodded, his expression contemplative. "You must travel a lot." "I do," Jackson said simply, offering no further details. He could see the man's curiosity piqued, but he wasn't ready to reveal more just yet. "Well," the man continued, leaning back in his seat, "it's always fascinating to see what stories people carry with them. I'm Robert, by the way." He extended a hand. Jackson took it, his grip firm. "Jackson." The handshake lingered just a moment longer than necessary, as though Robert were trying to glean something about Jackson from the interaction. When he finally released Jackson's hand, his curiosity remained evident. "What line of work are you in, if you don't mind me asking?" Robert said, his tone casual but probing. "I've had my hand in a few different things over the years," Jackson replied, keeping his answer deliberately vague. "Mostly business." Robert nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Interesting. You must have done well for yourself to land up here." Jackson smiled faintly. "I've been fortunate." The conversation ended there, with Robert sensing that Jackson wasn't inclined to share more. But the exchange had left an impression, not just on Robert but on the others seated nearby who had overheard the interaction. Jackson could feel their curiosity simmering, though they kept their questions to themselves. Dinner service began soon after, with the flight attendants moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Jackson noticed how the interactions between the crew and the passengers varied, how some passengers treated the attendants with warmth and respect, while others barked orders or ignored them entirely. It was another layer of the social hierarchy at play, a reminder of how power dynamics shifted in different contexts. When the attendant reached Jackson, her demeanor seemed more relaxed than it had been earlier. Perhaps she had sensed something different about him, something that set him apart from the usual occupants of these seats. He ordered a simple meal, thanking her with a warm smile that seemed to put her at ease. As Jackson ate, he observed the room, noting how the atmosphere in first class was both intimate and isolating. The individual pods created a sense of privacy, but they also reinforced the separateness of each passenger. It was a space designed for comfort but devoid of connection, a reflection of the modern world in many ways. After dinner, the lights dimmed, and passengers settled in for the night. Jackson reclined his seat, his thoughts turning inward. He thought about the life he had built, the challenges he had overcome, and the people who had shaped his journey. He thought about the assumptions people made, the judgments they cast without knowing the full story. He recalled a moment from his youth, long before he had achieved the success that now defined him. He had been a young man then, fresh out of college and full of ambition, but constantly underestimated because of his appearance. He remembered walking into a bank to apply for a loan, dressed in his best suit, only to be met with skepticism and condescension. The loan officer had barely glanced at his application before dismissing him, her tone dripping with doubt. That experience had fueled Jackson's determination to prove himself, to succeed despite the barriers placed in his path. And he had succeeded, spectacularly so. But even now, decades later, he couldn't escape the biases that had followed him throughout his life. They were quieter now, more insidious, but they were still there. As the plane soared through the night sky, Jackson felt a deep sense of resolve. His experiment was about more than just observing human behavior, it was about challenging it, about using his experiences to inspire change. He had spent a lifetime defying expectations, and he wasn't about to stop now. Eventually, he drifted off to sleep, his mind quiet but his heart determined. When he woke, the plane was beginning its descent, the city lights below twinkling like a sea of stars. Jackson sat up, ready for the final chapter of his journey, knowing that the most important moments were still to come. The plane touched down smoothly, the cabin filling with the muffled sounds of passengers preparing to disembark. Jackson remained seated, unhurried, as others began the predictable shuffle to retrieve their belongings and queue up in the aisle. He had learned long ago that there was no point in rushing. Life's most profound lessons often came in the moments when everyone else was too busy to notice. When his turn came, he rose, sliding his briefcase strap over his shoulder. He moved down the aisle and through the jet bridge, stepping into the terminal of yet another international airport. This one was sleek and modern, its walls adorned with abstract art and its corridors humming with the sound of footsteps, announcements, and luggage wheels. Jackson took in the scene, his mind shifting to the final phase of his experiment. Unlike the anonymity of the lounge or the exclusivity of the first-class cabin, this part of his journey would place him in the open, surrounded by a cross-section of society. The airport was a microcosm of the world, its spaces designed for efficiency but teeming with the unpredictable elements of human nature. Here, Jackson would be seen, judged, and perhaps ignored altogether. As he approached customs, he noticed the lines had already formed. There were two main lanes, one for those with diplomatic or expedited status and another for the general public. Jackson had always qualified for the expedited lane, but today, he chose the longer, slower one. He wanted to observe, to immerse himself in the shared experiences of everyday travelers. The line moved at a sluggish pace, with people shifting restlessly, checking their phones, or murmuring complaints under their breath. Jackson stood quietly, his posture relaxed, his gaze calm. Ahead of him, a mother struggled to soothe a crying toddler while simultaneously balancing her carry-on and passports. Behind him, a young man in a hoodie tapped his foot impatiently, earbuds in, oblivious to the world around him. When Jackson finally reached the customs officer, he handed over his passport without a word. The officer, a stern-looking man with sharp eyes, scanned the document and then Jackson's face. The pause that followed was brief but telling. It was the kind of pause Jackson had come to expect, a hesitation that betrayed the officer's thoughts. "What's the purpose of your visit?" the officer asked, his tone professional, but slightly guarded. "Business," Jackson replied evenly. The officer's eyes flicked to Jackson's attire, the well-worn denim jacket, the faded sweater, the scuffed briefcase. There was a momentary flicker of doubt, as though the man were trying to reconcile Jackson's appearance with his stated purpose. But he said nothing further, stamping the passport and waving Jackson through. The interaction left Jackson with a familiar sense of disquiet. It was a small moment, insignificant to anyone else, but to him, it was a reminder of the quiet prejudices that still shaped the world. He moved on, his step steady, his expression unreadable. The arrival hall was a hive of activity, with families reuniting, business travelers rushing to their next destination, and tourists navigating the unfamiliar terrain. Jackson took his time, his eyes scanning the crowd, his thoughts reflecting on the journey so far. He had set out to explore how people judged one another based on appearances, and the results had been both expected and disheartening. But there had also been moments of connection, of kindness and curiosity that gave him hope. As he walked, he noticed a commotion near the exit. A man in a crisp suit was arguing loudly with a taxi driver, his voice carrying above the general noise of the terminal. Jackson paused, watching the scene unfold. The businessman was gesturing angrily, his tone dismissive and condescending. The driver, an older man with a weary expression, tried to explain something, his voice calm but firm. Jackson felt a familiar tug in his chest, a mix of frustration and empathy. He had seen this dynamic play out countless times, someone in a position of perceived power belittling another who they deemed beneath them. Without hesitation, Jackson approached the scene. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice steady but authoritative. The businessman turned, his expression shifting to irritation as he sized up Jackson. "This driver doesn't seem to understand basic directions," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I'm trying to get to a meeting, and he's wasting my time." The driver looked at Jackson, his eyes filled with a quiet plea. "I was just explaining that the road he wants to take is closed for construction. I offered an alternate route, but he won't listen." Jackson nodded, his gaze moving between the two men. "Sounds like a simple misunderstanding," he said. Then, addressing the businessman, he added, "Perhaps you could trust his judgment. He knows the roads better than anyone." The businessman hesitated, clearly annoyed but also unsure how to respond. There was something in Jackson's demeanor, an unshakable calm, a quiet authority, that seemed to disarm him. With a huff, he muttered, "Fine," and climbed into the taxi without another word. The driver turned to Jackson, gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "People don't usually step in like that." Jackson smiled. "It's the least I could do. Safe travels." As the taxi pulled away, Jackson felt a renewed sense of purpose. These moments, small acts of standing up for others, were what truly defined a person's character. It wasn't about wealth, status, or appearances, it was about humanity. Finally, Jackson reached the car service that had been arranged to pick him up. The driver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, greeted him warmly. "Mr. Reed," she said, her tone respectful. "Welcome. Let me take that for you." She reached for his briefcase, but Jackson shook his head. "I've got it," he said with a smile. "Thank you." As they drove through the city, Jackson watched the world pass by outside the window. The streets were alive with motion, a blend of chaos and rhythm that felt both familiar and new. He thought about the journey he had just completed, the people he had encountered, and the truths he had uncovered. His experiment had revealed much about human nature, the good, the bad, and everything in between. When they arrived at his destination, a sleek glass building that reflected the city skyline, Jackson stepped out, briefcase in hand. The driver wished him well, and he thanked her before turning toward the entrance. The doorman greeted him with a polite nod, holding the door open as Jackson entered. Inside, the lobby was a symphony of polished surfaces and muted colors, a space designed to impress without overwhelming. Jackson made his way to the elevator, his steps unhurried. As the doors closed behind him, he allowed himself a moment to reflect. He had spent the past 2 days navigating a world that often judged him unfairly, and now he was about to step into a room where those judgments would be turned on their head. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened to reveal a boardroom filled with people. They turned as Jackson entered, their faces lighting up with recognition and respect. This was his domain, the place where his reputation preceded him, where his accomplishments spoke louder than any assumptions based on his appearance. "Mr. Reed," one of the executives said, rising to shake his hand. "It's an honor to have you here." Jackson smiled, his grip firm. "The honor is mine," he replied. As he took his seat at the head of the table, Jackson couldn't help but think back to the people he had encountered during his journey, the flight attendant, the young woman in the lounge, the customs officer, the taxi driver. Each interaction had been a reminder of the world's complexities, of the biases and kindnesses that defined human nature. Now, as he prepared to lead the meeting, he felt a deep sense of resolve. His journey wasn't just about observing the world, it was about changing it, one interaction at a time. And with every step forward, he carried with him the quiet strength of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in its potential for greatness.